anti-tank weaponry showed that the tank was not invulnerable. During the invasion of Poland, tanks performed in a more traditional role in close cooperation with infantry units. But in the Battle of France, deep independent armored penetrations were executed by the Germans, a technique later called blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg used innovative combined arms tactics and radios in all of the tanks to provide a level of tactical flexibility and power that surpassed that of the Allied armor. The French army, with tanks equal or superior to the German tanks in both quality and quantity, employed a linear defensive strategy in which the armored cavalry units were made subservient to the needs of the infantry armies to cover their entrenchment in Belgium. 40. In addition, they lacked radios in many of their tanks and headquarters. 48. Which limited their ability to respond to German attacks. In accordance with blitzkrieg methods, German tanks bypassed enemy strongpoints and could radio for close air support to destroy them, or leave them to the infantry. A related development, motorized infantry allowed some of the troops to keep up with the tanks and create highly mobile combined arms forces. 40. The defeat of a major military power within weeks shocked the rest of the world, spurring tank and anti-tank weapon development. Cutaway of an M4A4 Sherman tank, the primary tank used by the United States and a number of the other Western Allies during the Second World War. The North African campaign also provided an important battleground for tanks, as the flat, desolate terrain with relatively few obstacles or urban environments was ideal for conducting mobile armored warfare. However, this battlefield also showed the importance of logistics, especially in armored force, as the principal warring armies, the German Afrika Korps and the British Eighth Army, often outpaced their supply trains in repeated attacks and counter-attacks on each other, resulting in complete stalemate. This situation would not be resolved until 1942, when during the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Afrika Korps, crippled by disruptions in their supply lines, had 95% of its tanks destroyed, 49, and was forced to retreat by a massively reinforced Eighth Army, the first in a series of defeats that would eventually lead to the surrender of the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets had a superior tank design, the T-34. 50. A lack of preparations for the Axis surprise attack, mechanical problems, poor training of the crews and incompetent leadership caused the Soviet machines to be surrounded and destroyed in large numbers. However, interference from Adolf Hitler, 51, the geographic scale of the conflict, the dogged resistance of the Soviet combat troops, and the Soviets' massive advantages in the Battle of Kursk was credited to the largest tank battle ever fought, with each side deploying nearly 3,000 tanks. Manpower and production capability prevented a repeat of the German successes of 1940. 52. Despite early successes against the Soviets, the Germans were forced to outgun their Panzer Force, and to design and build both the larger and more expensive Tiger heavy tank in 1942, and the Panther medium tank the following year. In doing so, the Wehrmacht denied the infantry and other support arms production priorities that they needed to remain equal partners with the increasingly sophisticated tanks, in turn violating the principle of combined arms they had pioneered. 13. Soviet developments following the invasion included upgunning the T-34, development of self-propelled anti-tank guns such as the Su-152 and deployment of the IS-2 in the closing stages of the war, with the T-34 being the most produced tank of World War II, totaling up to some 65,000 examples by May 1945. Sherman tanks joining the U.S. Fifth Army forces in the beachhead at Anzio during the Italian campaign 1944. Much like the Soviets, when entering World War II 6 months later, December 1941, The United States mass production capacity enabled it to rapidly construct thousands of relatively cheap M4 Sherman medium tanks. A compromise all round, the Sherman was reliable and formed a large part of the Anglo-American ground forces, but in a tank versus tank battle was no match for the Panther. A Tiger. 53, numerical and logistical superiority and the successful use of combined arms allowed the Allies to overrun the German forces during the Battle of Normandy. Upgunned versions with the 76mm gun M1 and the 17-pounder were introduced to improve them for's firepower, but concerns about protection remained despite apparent armor deficiencies. A total of some 42,000 Shermans were built and delivered to the Allied nations using it during the war years, a total second only to the T-34. Tank hulls were modified to produce flame tanks, mobile rocket artillery, and combat engineering vehicles for tasks including mine clearing and bridging. 54, specialized self-propelled guns, most of which could orbit as tank destroyers, were also both developed by the Germans with their Sturmgeschützpanzerjäger and Jagdpanzer vehicles and the Samokhodnaya Ustanovka families of AFVs for the Soviets. Such turretless, casemate-style tank destroyers and assault guns were less complex, stripped-down tanks carrying heavy guns, solely firing forward. The firepower and low cost of these vehicles made them attractive, but as manufacturing techniques improved and larger turret rings made larger tank guns feasible, the gun turret was recognized as the most effective mounting for the main gun to allow movement in a different direction from firing, enhancing tactical flexibility. 40. Cold War. During the Cold War, tension between the Warsaw Pact countries and North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, countries created an arms race that ensured that tank development proceeded largely as it had during World War II. The essence of tank designs during the Cold War had been hammered out in the closing stages of World War II. Large turrets, capable suspension systems, greatly improved engines, slow-head armor and large caliber, 90mm and larger, guns were standard. Tank design during the Cold War built on this foundation and included improvements to fire control, gyroscopic gun stabilization, communications, primarily radio, and crew comfort, and saw the introduction of laser rangefinders and infrared night vision equipment. Armor technology progressed in an ongoing race against improvements in anti-tank weapons, especially anti-tank guided missiles like the TOW. The Cold War-era Soviet T-72 was the most widely deployed main battle tank across the war. 55 medium tanks of World War II evolved into the main battle tank, MBT, of the Cold War and took over the majority of tank roles on the battlefield. This gradual transition occurred in the 1950s and 1960s due to anti-tank guided missiles, Sabot ammunition and high-explosive anti-tank warheads. World War II had shown that the speed of a light tank was no substitute for armor and firepower, and medium tanks were vulnerable to newer weapon technology, rendering them obsolete. In a trend started in World War II, economies of scale led to serial production of progressively upgraded models of all major tanks during the Cold War. For the same reason, many upgraded post-World War tanks and their derivatives, for example, the T-55 and T-72, remain in active service around the world, and even an obsolete tank may be the most formidable weapon on battlefields in many parts of the world. 56. Among the tanks of the 1950s were the British Centurion and Soviet T-54/55 in service from 1946, and the US M48 from 1951. 57. These three vehicles formed the bulk of the armored forces of NATO and the Warsaw Pact throughout much of the Cold War. Lessons learned from tanks such as the Leopard 1, M48 Patton series, Chieftain, and T-72 led to the contemporary Leopard 2, M1 Abrams, Challenger 2, C-1 Air Riot, T-90 and Merkava 4. Tanks and anti-tank weapons of the Cold War era saw action in a number of proxy wars like the Korean War, Vietnam War, Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, Soviet-Afghan War and Arab-Israeli conflicts, culminating with the Yom Kippur War. The T-55, for example, has seen action in no fewer than 32 conflicts. In these wars the US or NATO countries and the Soviet Union or China consistently backed opposing forces. Proxy wars were studied by Western and Soviet military analysts and provided a contribution to the Cold War tank development process. 21st century. An Italian C-1 air riot in 2022. The role of tank versus tank combat is becoming diminished. Tanks work in concert with infantry in urban warfare by deploying them ahead of the platoon. When engaging enemy infantry, tanks can provide covering fire on the battlefield. Conversely, tanks can spearhead attacks when infantry are deployed in personnel carriers. 58. Tanks were used to spearhead the initial US invasion of Iraq in 2003. As of 2005, there were 1,100 M1 Abrams used by the United States Army in the course of the Iraq War, and they have proven to have an unexpectedly high level of vulnerability to road-city bombs. 59. A relatively new type of remotely detonated mine. The explosively formed penetrator has been used with some success against American armored vehicles, particularly the Bradley fighting vehicle. However, with upgrades to their armor in the rear, M1s have proven invaluable in fighting insurgents in urban combat, particularly at the Battle of Fallujah, where the US Marines brought in 2 extra brigades. 60. Israeli Merkava tanks contain features that enable them to support infantry in low-intensity conflicts, LIC, and counter-terrorism operations. Such features are the rear door and rear corridor, enabling the tank to carry infantry and embark safely. The IMI APAM MPT multipurpose ammunition round, advanced C4s. Systems and recently, Trophy Active Protection System which protects the tank from shoulder-launched anti-tank weapons. During the Second Intifada further modifications were made, designated as Merkava Mk. 3D Baz LIC. Research and Development. Graphic representation of the US Army's cancelled XM1202 mounted combat system in terms of firepower. The focus of 2010's era R&D was increased detection capabilities such as thermal imagers, automated fire control systems for the guns and increased muzzle energy from the gun to improve range, accuracy and armor penetration. 61. The most mature future gun technology is the electrothermal chemical gun. 62. The XM291 electrothermal chemical tank gun has gone through successful multiple firing sequences on a modified American M8 armored gun system chassis. 63. To improve tank protection, one field of research involves making the tank invisible to radar by adapting stealth technologies originally designed for aircraft. Improvements to camouflage and attempts to render it invisible through active camouflage, which changes according to where the tank is located, are being pursued. Research is also ongoing in electromagnetic armor systems to disperse or deflect incoming shaped charges. 64, 65, as well as various forms of active protection systems to prevent incoming projectiles, RPGs, missiles, etc. from striking the tank. Mobility may be enhanced in future tanks by the use of diesel-electric or turbine-electric series hybrid drives first used in a primitive, gasoline-engined form with Porsche Celephant German tank destroyer of 1943, improving fuel efficiency while reducing the size and weight of the power plant. 66. Furthermore, advances in gas turbine technology, including the use of advanced recuperators, 67, have allowed for reduction in engine volume and mass to less than 1 cubic meter and 1 metric ton, respectively, while maintaining fuel efficiency similar to that of a diesel engine. 68. In line with the new doctrine of network-centric warfare, the 2010 ESIRA modern battle tank shows increasing sophistication in its electronics and communication systems. The future of tanks has been challenged by the proliferation of relatively inexpensive anti-tank guided missiles and rockets during the Russo-Ukrainian War. 69. Design. Labeled diagram of an M1 Abrams. The three traditional factors determining a tank's capability effectiveness are its firepower, protection, and mobility. 70. 71. Firepower is the ability of a tank's crew to identify, engage and destroy enemy tanks and other targets using its large caliber cannon. Protection is the degree to which the tank's armor, profile and camouflage enables the tank crew to evade a detection, protect themselves from enemy fire, and retain vehicle functionality during and after combat. Mobility includes how well the tank can be transported by rail, sea, or air to the operational staging area, from the staging area by road or over terrain towards the enemy, and tactical movement by the tank over the battlefield during combat, including traversing of obstacles and rough terrain. The variations of tank designs have been determined by the way these three fundamental features are blended. For instance, in 1937, the French doctrine focused on firepower and protection more than mobility because tanks worked in intimate liaison with the infantry. 72. There was also the case of the development of a heavy cruiser tank, which focused on armor and firepower to challenge Germany's Tiger and Panther tanks. 73. Classification. Tanks have been classified by weight, role, or other criteria. That has changed over time and place. Classification is determined by the prevailing theories of armored warfare, which have been altered in turn by rapid advances in technology. No one classification system works across all periods or all nations. In particular, weight-based classification is inconsistent between countries and eras. In World War I, the first tank designs focused on crossing wide trenches, requiring very long and larger vehicles, such as the British Mark I. These became classified as heavy tanks. Tanks that fulfilled other combat roles were smaller, like the French Renault Foot. These were classified as light tanks or tankettes. Many late war and interwar tank designs diverged from these according to new, though mostly untried concepts for future tank roles and tactics. Tank classifications varied considerably according to each nation's own tank development, such as cavalry tanks, fast tanks, and breakthrough tanks. During World War II, many tank concepts were found unsatisfactory and discarded, mostly leaving the more multi-role tanks. These became easier to classify. Tank classes based on weight, and the corresponding transport and logistical needs, led to new definitions of heavy and light tank classes, with medium tanks covering the balance of those between. The British maintained cruiser tanks, focused on speed, and infantry tanks that traded speed for more armor. Tank destroyers are tanks or other armored fighting vehicles specifically designed to defeat enemy tanks. Assault guns are armored fighting vehicles that could combine the roles of infantry tanks and tank destroyers. Some tanks were converted to flame tanks, specializing on close-in attacks on enemy strongholds with flamethrowers. As the war went on, tanks tended to become larger and more powerful, shifting some tank classifications and leading to super heavy tanks. Experience and technology advances during the Cold War continued to consolidate tank roles. With the worldwide adoption of the modern main battle tank designs, which favor a modular universal design, most other classifications are dropped from modern terminology. All main battle tanks tend to have a good balance of speed, armor, and firepower, even while technology continues to improve all three. Being fairly large, main battle tanks can be complemented with light tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles or similar relatively lighter armored fighting vehicles, typically in the roles of armored reconnaissance, amphibious or air assault operations, or against enemies